What's up everyone? I hope you're doing fantastic. If you're new here, my name's Kohen Hansen and I'm a professional photographer and videographer based in Brisbane, Australia. Now in this video, I wanted to cover some camera basics. So if you're a beginner, maybe you've just upgraded from your smartphone and you're looking at purchasing a DSLR or a mirrorless camera and you're not really sure about where to start, you've seen there's lots of buttons, you want to know what you need to do to start creating amazing content, this video is for you. So the first thing I wanted to cover is the difference between a DSLR and a mirrorless camera. So this camera here is a DSLR and this camera here is a mirrorless camera. Now DSLR stands for digital single lens reflex and mirrorless, as it sounds, has no mirror. Now let's talk about what that means. So in a DSLR, when you look through the viewfinder, what you see is exactly the light that comes into the lens because there's mirrors that reflect the light from the lens up into the viewfinder. On a mirrorless camera, you don't have that. On a mirrorless camera, the light comes in to the lens, there's no mirrors, so the viewfinder is actually a small little screen. Now in that screen, what you see is exactly what your camera sensor sees. That means when you change your exposure using the different dials and functions we'll talk about later, you can see those changes real time looking through that viewfinder. On a DSLR, you're always going to see the same image through the viewfinder, no matter what your settings are. So that could mean something could look really good through the viewfinder, but when you take the photo, you might notice it's a bit too bright or a bit too dark. Now we're going to talk about how you can choose your settings correctly and make sure that your photos are looking absolutely fantastic. Now when you're taking photos, there's really three key settings that you need to think about. The first of them is shutter speed. Now shutter speed is how long the sensor, so the part of the camera that captures the light, how long that is exposed to the light. So a really fast shutter speed could be great for things like sports where you're trying to freeze the moment exactly as you saw it. Or a slower shutter speed could be really good if you're trying to make water that's flowing down a waterfall look really smooth. What the shutter speed also does is when you have a faster shutter speed, because less light is able to come in and hit your camera's sensor, in the same conditions, a faster shutter speed is going to result in a darker image than if you had a slower shutter speed and your other settings remain the same. So that's an important consideration when you're looking at taking photos in low light situations and you may not have the flexibility of lots of natural light like you might have out on the sports field. The second thing to talk about is aperture. When we're talking about aperture, inside every lens there is blades that basically can close in on each other or widen to either let more or less light through the lens and into your sensor. So if you use a really wide aperture, which means the number is lower, like f2.8, you can get a really nice depth of field, so a blurry background. Or if you use a smaller aperture, like f5.6, you can get more in focus because there's less background blur. But once again with aperture, a wider aperture lets in more light, so it will make your image brighter, and a smaller aperture will let less light in, meaning your image is going to be darker. And finally, the third thing to talk about is ISO. Now, unlike shutter speed and aperture, which rely on mechanical things changing inside your camera, ISO is all about the sensor's sensitivity to light. When I go to take a photo, the first thing I do is set my ISO value to the lowest that it can go. Now, that'll probably give me a really dark image to begin with, but that's okay. The next thing I'll do, I'll work out how much background blur I want. Usually my style, I like to have my subject separated from the background, so I'll start with my lens on its widest aperture. So on this lens, it's f4, and the one I'm filming on right now is f2.8. After I've set my aperture, then I move over to my shutter speed. Now, if I'm taking photos outside in the daylight, usually I can just increase my shutter speed until I get the correct exposure. An exception to that might be if I'm taking photos of a sports game and there's still a little bit of motion blur when I take the picture, and I can see people's arms are slightly blurred when they're running, for instance. What I'd do in that situation is I'd increase my shutter speed a little bit and also then increase my ISO to counteract for that exposure. The benefit of doing it this way, where you set your aperture and shutter speed first, is that you get to make any artistic choices of how you want your image to look first, and then you start playing with your ISO, which when you increase it can lead to more noise in your photo. Noise is like the grain that you'll get. And for the most part, with today's modern cameras, it isn't really that much of a big deal because these cameras perform fantastically in low light. However, it's still going to allow you to get the cleanest looking images by setting the other settings first and then moving on to your ISO. Now, let's talk about low light situations for a second. With your shutter speed, you want to be careful that you don't decrease the shutter speed too much. Usually, I'll never go below 1/100th of a second if I'm taking photos of people at night. The reason for this is that any kind of camera shake that you get with your hands when you press down and take the picture can translate into motion blur in your photo. At the end of the day, you don't want that. That's all I have for you guys today. If you have any questions, please leave a comment and press the subscribe button if you want to see more content like this, because I'll be doing more tutorials to show you the ins and outs of how to use your camera and how to use it out in the field to get the most out of your images. And if you're in the Brisbane area and are looking for photography and videography services, then click on the link down in the video description below to see my website, contact information, and Instagram. Fantastic. I hope you have a great day. See you again soon.